Hello and welcome to the Out of the Lab podcast, where we discuss the operational challenges in cell and gene therapy. Each episode, we sit down with a different voice in the space, from executives and scientists to patients and advocates, to figure out exactly where the industry is breaking down and how to fix it. Today, I'm joined with Dr. Rishi Chavan at the Children's Hospital of Orange County. Rishi, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Nick.
Well, Rishi, you have a unique position compared to the previous guests on the show in that you are sort of on both sides of the clinical practice and the research of cell and gene therapies. And the first thing I'd love to get into is to hear sort of your perspective on where the key challenges are from your viewpoint.
Thank you so much. So, a little bit about my background. I'm a pediatric oncologist by training, focused on stem cell transplant for kids and young adults. And as a part of that, I think I do take care of patients, children with actual malignancies, mostly hematological malignancies, and also some non-malignant conditions where we require bone marrow transplant. And I've seen the field evolve from transplant to CAR T cells and gene therapy and even further along. But the joke is like I would like to say that stem cell transplant is one of the first immunotherapies that was ever formed, kind of thing. And I think there is a lot of lessons that we can look at, like how the field of transplant evolved, and learn from that to help guide us in this new era of cell and gene therapy right now. The challenges that I see mostly are for access to cell and gene therapy. And some of the challenges are the financial toxicity, the regulatory burden, and also challenges with source materials or the vein-to-vein time, how long it takes for the manufacturing of these products, maintaining the patients between that time, and then also post-infusion challenges as well. A lot of times, there are social barriers. Patients need to be followed closely even after the infusion. And so that's why what happens is that the cell and gene therapies become restricted to a select few who have access to these cares and not necessarily across the board.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. And one thing that'd be a great place to sort of start is looking at that history you mentioned of stem cell. And what do you see as the kind of key lessons that could be learned from that era towards the current one?
So I'll share something that I use analogies a lot when I'm talking to my patients and my colleagues, and I think in analogies, and that helps me understand things. So one of the analogies is that when cancer is by definition um, a problem with your immune system, right? And that's why people who are older tend to get much more cancer diagnosis compared to kids or young adults. And the reason is because as we get older, our immune system is affected and cannot, fight cancers as well. So by definition, what we understand is that cancers keep happening in our body all throughout our lives in small proportions, and then our immune system takes care of it. When somebody develops a measurable disease, or what we kind of call clinically diagnosed with cancer, what it really means is that the immune system failed to take care or keep that cancer cells into check. Your question, when we do a stem cell transplant, what we are essentially doing, and here I'm talking about allogenic stem cell transplant, is we are changing the person's immune system with the idea that the new immune system will not only help prevent infections and other things, but also will be able to fight the cancer. So this is why I think that a stem cell transplant is one of the first immunotherapies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's it's an immune replacement. And something else you mentioned there was after patients are treated, kind of follow up monitoring. This is something that has come up previously with patient advocates, and from some perspectives, since it's such a brand new field, there seems to be kind of room in that regards. I'm curious what your perspective is. Like, what is the current standard, and what do you see as the kind of direction moving forward with that?
So again, there are institutions and organizations who are doing cell therapies, transplants, even in their outpatient infusion centers. It has not yet become a commonplace for every institution. But I think more and more, as we are looking at how to develop efficiencies or save cost, we are going into an era where we could do infusions as outpatient. Same thing goes for patient monitoring too. You could potentially continue to monitor patients based on patient reported outcomes or remote patient monitoring uh, from their home or in clinic visits or outpatient. You don't have to have them necessarily come to the hospital. But again, this depends on what kind of a setup do you have, what kind of infrastructure you have. The post cell therapy or post transplant care is really, really important because if you think about the success of any kind of therapy, it depends on the supportive care. So you need to have a safety net or a supportive care network where even post transplant, because let's say for transplant, we need to monitor for GVHD or acute or chronic GVHD or infections. Same thing with CAR T cells, you need to monitor for long term side effects as well as infections and other conditions. So because these patients are still at risk for developing side effects, even let's say 6 months, a year post therapy, the post monitoring is very, very crucial.
Now, this is something I'd like to really understand better. So, understand there's various parts. There's the infusion, post-infusion monitoring, and something that's come up about patient access is how far patients have to travel. Like we're talking about cancer patients here, they're not in good shape, and uh, there's a lot of them don't want to, like, aren't able to, may not have the sort of family support in order to travel. So I'm curious how in the post monitoring, having more accessibility in sort of smaller communities, how that might impact the overall patient experience.
So I think, have you heard of Project Echo? So again, I'm not completely aware of the current state or the details, but the Project Echo was a hub and spoke model for specialists to communicate with generalists and to be able to take care of patients across the board, kind of thing. And I think even in cell and gene therapy, we talk about this hub and spoke model, wherein several institutions will have a central lab or a central place where the cells get manufactured and then you kind of distribute them to multiple places. I think a similar approach can be created, especially in today's world with all the digital resources that we have, where we create an app or a way of remote patient monitoring and like have an active patient reported outcomes forum where you can have a decentralized way of monitoring these patients. Um, Oftentimes, the challenges or the barriers become for reimbursements. Like we saw, post COVID and other things, like, the reimbursements for telemedicine or the reimbursements for remote patient monitoring are not the same as they are for in-house care. And so sometimes those become a barrier also to incentivize more and more physicians to be a part of that hub and spoke model or a model where you can care for patients at different places.
Okay.
But yeah, it's definitely possible. Yeah.
That is an exciting future. Now,
Yeah.
talking about reimbursements, one thing I'd be curious to talk about is and to sort of understand about the accreditation processes. This is something that's come up as one of the sort of key barriers these days is the accreditations that are needed for the reimbursement. I'd love to understand what are the accreditations, who has to think about them, yeah, some of the sort of the practical realities.
So let me start with saying this that I don't think accreditation is a bad thing. I think the guardrails are necessary for everything that we do in life. Even the current AI debate, like how fast the AI is evolving and all that people are talking about, like you may need some healthy guardrails and all those things, right?
Mhm.
So similarly, whenever you are at a forefront for a therapy, just like cell and gene therapy is right now, there has to be some guardrails, right? Like because as a institution or as a physician, we are all first do no harm, right? That is why the accreditations exist. Uh, I also feel like the accreditations are not uniform, meaning, say, a country like US might have different set of accreditations. Canada might have different. Uh, Europe might have different set of accreditations, and also China or India might have different set of accreditations. Now, this creates a further challenge where you feel like, certain places where if the accreditations are not as strong or rigid, the development might become faster. But again, it depends on how, meaning the purpose of accreditations, I feel, is to kind of protect the patients that are getting treated, right? So this is where the reimbursements also came into play, wherein the reimbursing companies almost kind of outsourced their responsibility, which is making sure that their members are protected and they're getting the right treatment. When you think about the reimbursing agency like the third party payers or insurance companies, what they are, the place that they are coming from is actually they want to make sure that their members, the lives that they are protecting, get the right kind of care, right? It's would be terrible if there was no accreditations. Somebody could go to a quack or a like a place, and then there could be bad things that might happen, which has happened in the history, and that's where the accreditations come into play. So I feel like the reimbursement companies have almost like, because of the complexity of cell and gene therapy, they have outsourced in a way, saying that like, okay, if a center or a place has to do transplant, they need to be accredited by certain accreditation bodies. So it becomes almost a requirement. Uh, and if you think about transplant, actually the history of transplant goes back wherein the early transplanters actually came together and then they said that, okay, we are going to accredit ourselves even before, thinking about reimbursements or anything. And that actually worked in their favor because by doing this right now, there was uh, the field grew because of doing this. Like, if I want to quote one thing, is that so anything that is risky and expensive will need to be accredited. Currently, what is happening with cell and gene therapy is that it is also highly, very, very risky for patients
Mhm.
and also expensive at the same time. And so I think there is no way that we can forego the need for accreditation. And there are different accreditation bodies, including AABB,
Mhm.
and they established the standards even before the reimbursement came through. Like historically, AABB was actually established in 1947, and 1975 was when AABB published their first national standards for blood banking, and then kind of launched the inspection program, which facilitated, several hospitals to have those services. Uh, and so the whole point is that the FACT, which is Federal Accreditation for Cellular Therapies, was established in early 1990s, and it was 1996 when they had a joint initiative with ISCT, and created kind of standards so that the quality of care, whether it was received at multiple places, would be the same thing. What you were asking before is that if you want to extend the quality of care to different centers, how would you reassure that? And
Mhm.
I want to use another analogy. When you drink coffee from Starbucks, it's probably going to be the same coffee whether you drink it in any kind of Starbucks. So
Mhm.
that's what I mean by quality controls.
Yeah.
And so in order to establish those quality controls, you need to work with accreditation bodies. And once you have those, then the reimbursements will follow.
Okay. So it's basically a quality standard to ensure consistency.
Right. It's basically a quality standard to ensure consistency, and also that allows you to compare outcomes and results across the board.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Now, when we're talking about quality standards, I'm curious if the requirements are similar to those, say, for manufacturing, like GMP, where they're just normal quality documentation, like SOPs, MBRs, those types of things, or like what does it look like for a group to become accredited? Is it a documentation sort of dossier that has to be prepared and then approved?
No, it's more than that. Like, so you have to have a rigid or a robust quality control program
Mhm.
together. So what it means is that, just like you said, you have SOPs, which are standard operating procedures. And along with SOPs, you have a room for planned and unplanned deviations.
Mhm.
So it doesn't mean that just because you have an SOP that every case will fit the SOP, but that becomes like a plan that you got to follow the protocol, you're going to follow the SOP for most of the time, 99% of the time. But it allows you that if there is a planned or unplanned deviation, then you account for that.
Mhm.
The quality monitoring process, just like a CMC quality monitoring process on the clinical side too, kind of looks into were like safety reports. Was there a near miss? Was there an actual harm done for the patient? The idea, because is that to ensure patient safety, most hospitals will have a culture of over reporting, like people,
Mhm.
like, freedom of reporting, anonymous reporting. And then it is a job of the quality team to kind of accumulate all these reports and then classify them properly, and then see if there is a corrective action that is required for any particular issue. Now, when you maintain such tight quality controls and you maintain the more so, what you control is the process.
Mhm.
You have to understand, when you are dealing with any disease condition or any therapy, the outcome is the outcome, but you cannot control the outcome.
Mhm.
What you can control is the process. So a lot of these processes, by using the SOPs, using the audits, using the quality meetings, is what you're trying to control is the process.
Mhm.
And this is to ensure the outcomes and the quality of the patient improvement. So a lot of, even when you think about phase 1, 2A or phase 2 or phase 3 trials, we are looking at outcomes, right? But in order to get good outcomes, I think you need to control the process, which is where the accreditation comes into play.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So uh more than just a package of compiled paperwork, SOPs, and so on. It is more of a quality management system in the sense that decisions and the way that deviations are handled are all systematized in a way that allows for consistency across the board.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. I will use another analogy. I mean, you've kind of heard of a chef and a cook,
Yeah.
right? So the way I think about it is, a chef is a more of a creative person. He's kind of sitting by himself, waiting for an inspiration, comes up with a recipe, and then the recipe is tested, which could be a phase 1, phase 2A trial, and then it becomes a standard of care. And then finally, that menu or a lab manual or a clinical manual gets rolled out, and there are multiple cooks who can cook that, and then you standardize the care accordingly, right? But in order to ensure, which is similar to some of the work that you are doing, in order to ensure that there is no loss of knowledge in this transfer, the tech transfer part, that's why you have the system.
Mhm.
Even the document control system, like you have for accreditation bodies, is necessary, because you don't want, like, somebody to misunderstand that, like, was it a should or a shall or always kind of thing, like, those words and the language cannot be misunderstood at that time. uh,
Okay, that's really interesting. So on the show, we've talked quite a bit about this in terms of manufacturing and these sorts of details, and exactly this sort of analogy you brought up of the chef and the cook. And in the manufacturing context, usually the chef is like the PhD scientist who invented it, and then the cook is the operator working in like a CDMO. I'd love to unpack on the sort of clinical side, what are the various roles involved, and where are some of the key challenges? What is some of that tacit knowledge that is at high risk of loss during communication?
So similar to on the lab side of things, similar to on the clinical side of things, right? Like say we work with physicians, and then within physicians there might be principal investigators and then sub investigators who are like like your chef or the kind of the PhD person, and then there is multiple people who are operators in the sense that like oncologists or transplanters who may actually be enrolling the patients and then following the protocols, right? So you might have a PI who designed a protocol or who designed a clinical study, maybe sitting in one place somewhere in the country or even outside the country. But however, the protocol is transferred to multiple centers and then they are enrolling patients there. And so in this process, you have to make sure that not only the people who are the site PIs or the people who are enrolling at local sites, they are aware of it, but also the nurses, the research coordinators, everybody understands. Because on any protocol, you have like the adverse event reporting and severe adverse event and other adverse event reporting. And so it is the responsibility of everybody involved in the study to be able to understand and report things correctly. Now, that is so the information flow is two ways, right? There is one way of information flow wherein the PI or whoever wrote the protocol, that information is being transmitted from the central place to the individual hospitals, the physicians there, the nurses there, the research coordinators there, all of the above, the data entry people there, and the quality accreditation people there as well. So all of this, the information flow is happening. And then there's another information flow which is happening the other side, whereas these people are collecting the information about exactly what is happening to the patients, maybe the adverse reactions, CRS, or other things. And then that information flow is going the other way to the PI or the central board. So does it make sense? So,
Yeah.
but in order to create this information flows, you need a guidebook for that itself. Like what is reportable, what is not reportable, both on clinical and study settings, kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like a waterfall where information is both flowing in the instructional direction and is being captured at the actual place where it's happening.
Right.
So one thing I'm sort of curious about on the clinical side is in the manufacturing side, there's GMP, sort of an overarching framework for how pharmaceuticals should be manufactured. And in each country, there are specific regulations as to the very nitty-gritty details of what that looks like. And are they the same regulations? Is it different regulations that apply in on the clinical side?
I would say they are similar. I wouldn't say they are same. Just like we have a quality system for the lab side and we have a quality system for the clinical side. And there are SOPs for the lab side, there are SOPs for the clinical side. There is audits for the clinical side, there is audits for the lab side. There is quality meeting requirements for both the clinical and the lab side. And sometimes there is a crosstalk. And when I say clinical, it includes the apheresis side too, because when you are collecting your source material, there is requirements for how do you collect it on the apheresis side as well, right? Because there's only two ways you can collect, either with apheresis or the other way is by bone marrow harvest. And of course, the third is the cord blood source and, cells from the cord blood as well. But so these are the three different ways. So your analogy, you would start from the whole journey travels with the cell, right? From the collection, then to the lab where there might be manipulation, either engineering, cell engineering or other manipulation, and then into the patient, and then what happens with the patient in the future also, right? Meaning how does the cells behave, right? Because with certain gene therapies early on, like, few years ago, we've seen like there is risk for second other things too, right? So that's what I meant by that these patients would have to be followed on for a long period of time. And that's where you need the accreditation thing. So we also have long-term survivor programs wherein we kind of follow patients up to several years after they are treated as well, in order to make sure that they don't have any long-term side effects or complications either from their chemotherapy or from the cell therapy or radiation. Yeah.
Wow. Uh, so much information there. And one thing that I'm curious about is when we're talking about the sort of study design and going back to the sort of parallel between the clinical and the manufacturing. So during these tech transfers on the manufacturing side, sometimes the liberty is available. You can send the the chef, so to speak, to the receiving site to clarify many of these missing details. And often this luxury will come about because they're not needed all at many sites at the same time. But I'm wondering, when you're talking about a large scale clinical trial and you have these principal investigators that have designed a protocol, is that same sort of flexibility possible, that they can necessarily go to each site that it's happening, or is it a little bit more complicated and difficult when you have so many people involved?
It's complicated, but it's doable, right? So that's where your accreditation comes into play.
Mhm.
So oftentimes there is rules that the SOPs need to be revised every 2 years.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because the knowledge base in the field is changing so quickly that you would definitely want people to stay on top of it and see if there is any new therapies or new things that need to change with the SOPs. Now, it is not enough only to change the SOPs, because once you change the SOPs, you also want to make sure that everybody who is using or either touching the product or the patient
Mhm.
is aware of the SOPs. So there
Yeah.
is a document control process and there is an education process. So now every time you make a change, you have to do a risk assessment, kind of thing. And also you have to do audits to make sure that the change you made is implemented or not. So whenever the accreditation bodies do their, kind of site visits or inspections kind of thing, that is what they're looking for. They're looking for whether a program has a good, robust quality system in place or not. They're looking at whether they are following the SOPs or not, whether they are editing or evaluating the SOPs to the current standards or not. Also, whether they are doing their regular audits or not. So every program has to have a complete audit schedule, right? Kind of thing. So, and then you kind of do audits based on that, and then you have a way of kind of reporting those audits in your quality management meetings. Most programs also require to have an annual quality meeting. And so the annual quality meeting, the purpose of that is to observe trends that could be missed with looking at shorter data spans. What I mean by that, let's say you have a quarterly view of things, which may not pick up something that you could see a trend where you see the whole 12-month data, right? When you see the whole 12-month data together in an annual audit, then you could see that, like, oh my God, like I think something is amiss here, or
Mhm.
maybe we had more complications in this area, or maybe we did really well here. And then if we did really well here, how could we publish that, or how could we share that with others? What's going on well for us? Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like the accreditation bodies, they're doing something very similar to what the FDA does when they're doing site visits and um, auditing. Would you say that's sort of a good parallel when, say, these drug developers are being audited by the regulatory bodies?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm getting a sort of better picture of this accreditation process. They're looking for a comprehensive quality management system, not just a sort of pile of documents. And there's been a shift from the FDA in terms of their expectations towards something they're calling computer software assurance. We were talking a bit about software, and one of the key messages they put out there was that they don't want documentation for its own sake. They want manufacturers in particular to really consider risk on patient outcomes. And I'd love to just sort of hear your thoughts on how that plays into the clinical side of things.
Yeah. So I don't want to quote or, one of the FDA speakers I heard kind of talked about not just like a phase one, two, three, four trial, but like almost like a continuum of trials.
Yes, yes.
And I think we are there where we have the capacity to do that. And there are registries built around it too. So CIBMTR is a registry which kind of captures all the transplant patients, and there are other registries too. So where we can continue to monitor them long term, and so it becomes a continuum kind of thing, right? Uh, but to answer your questions about the documents, I think it's kind of self-explanatory, right? Like because you want to, like Confucius, you don't want to say more than what you should, like, but at the same time, it should be clear and unambiguous so that anybody reads it can implement it the same way, right? Again, going back to our analogies, the document is almost like a blueprint, right?
Hmm.
Or a recipe for that matter. If you build a recipe, then it should be anybody should be able to implement that, right? I joke about it with my kids, like, think about it this way right now. Pancakes, if you want to eat pancakes, you could go to a wonderful restaurant and have nice pancakes. But most people will have pancakes at their home on a weekend morning where, you kind of open a box, you have the starting material there, and then you kind of mix the ingredients as per the guide says, and then you make beautiful pancakes. And then your kid thinks that their dad is the best chef ever because they can make nice pancakes, right? So the point is that I think going back to documentation, if it could be simpler, but not there is no room for misunderstanding, then that is the right documentation in my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that sounds very much in line with the principles of Alcoa Plus,
Mm.
for documentation to be attributable and legible and contemporaneous, but with certainly a focus on clarity.
Yeah. It's hard to say, but it also goes down to the whole issue about bringing the cost of care down, right?
Hmm.
Um, oftentimes people compare McDonald's with medicine kind of thing,
Hmm.
and again, it goes back to the same thing. Like I said, the Starbucks analogy, where you have the if you have the documentation correct, then you're going to ensure that the quality, no matter which franchise you go to, remains the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm imagining you could comprehensively say the direct cost impact of quality is reduced risk of failed of problems that are always expensive.
Exactly. I have when I'm talking to medical students or residents and fellows, I have a thing I always used to say, which would clear things up. I feel like a good, whatever you may call it, a scientist or a doctor is a person, not somebody who can recognize and treat complications. That's a given. Everybody should be able to recognize and treat complications or pivot when there is a problem in the lab or something like that. But a good scientist or a good doctor is somebody who can anticipate and prevent complications.
Hmm.
A lot of times the value in documenting or the value in writing a protocol or the value in writing down things also becomes that it allows you to brainstorm in real time and kind of think about, okay, how could we have what complications or what second order effects this might have, right? And so having a room full of people who've had actual clinical experience as well as lab experience can look at the documentation and say that, oh, this will never work, or this may work, but you may have these secondary problems which you may need to account for. So that is also the value of a well-written protocol or a well-written document.
So it sounds like
Anticipating what could go wrong.
so it sounds like the high quality documentation, it allows you to take a proactive approach, which can give you better outcomes than reacting as new things come about. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that would be fair. Yeah.
Wow.
But
Well,
but there's a nuance to it because you also want to make it so that not too cumbersome for people to read and understand, right? Because if it is too cumbersome, then maybe you might lose half your audience there, and people may not want to work in a field that requires so much of documentation, either writing, reading, or understanding and reporting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's actually quite a bit of an art to documentation, and part of that is balancing the requirements for detail with the practical use that people are going to be overwhelmed if they're bombarded by a massive pile of details. And it sounds like a really key part of effective documentation is knowing what needs to be detailed correctly and how it can be most succinctly expressed.
I'll use the analogy of Google Maps.
Mm-hmm.
You need some place where you can double click. You need some place where you can zoom in and zoom out, right? Because a good documentation or a good practice could be wherein you can say that, like, okay, give me a 30,000 feet overview of this process.
Yep.
Okay, here you have that. Now you could go into subsections and you can double click and you can expand on, and okay, now I have this. And then further along, you have your asterisk or an appendix somewhere where, okay, if I really need to understand this, how deep can I go? So that is a good way of understanding, like, how deep the documentation might be, kind of thing. And the analogy of Google Maps is also like kind of a step-by-step turn, right? Like just like in the lab, like, okay, if this, then that, if this, then that, kind of thing. Or kind of creating those nuances where when there is traffic jam, then you kind of use some place else or try to do a different route, which is what I meant by planned deviations versus unplanned deviations, right? So you have a mechanism where, okay, if it doesn't meet spec, then if it's still life-saving treatment, you have a way to do it, but you would have to document the planned deviation into it. Makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent analogy with Google Maps. And what you're really describing is telescoping information, being able to start from like the title and then go into summary and sections and so on all the way down. Now, it makes sense that for each individual granular step, as you're going through it, it's obviously the value there is obvious because you have to be able to actually execute the procedure. I'm curious about the higher level organizations like sections, summaries, purpose, title. What is when do you need to sort of zoom out if we go back to the Google Maps context? Like when are the times then that you need that higher level overview?
Since we are talking about communication and the importance of communication, I think the most important thing when you communicate is the why, right?
Yeah.
Even when I sit with a patient or a family and I start talking about that, hey, your child or you need a transplant or cell therapy or gene therapy, I think the most time that we spend is on the indication or why, right? We often say that, like, hey, if there was any other treatment available, we would prefer that, over this. But since we've exhausted all routes, this is absolutely necessary. And so that's why we are going to talk about what we're going to do, right? So your question about telescoping or zooming out is sometimes when people get bogged down by documentation or the subsections or the details, they forget the why.
Yeah.
So the zooming out kind of helps the why. And this is where I started. Like, the reason the accreditations is important, the reason the rules are important is for your safety. Even when you're driving on the road, like you have rules, you can, yellow on your left, white line on your right. Like, that's how you drive. You stop at the red signal. If you don't follow the rules, you will get into an accident, right? So similarly, when a patient is going through such a high risk treatment, which has a high reward too, you follow the rules. That's where. But I think if you start with the rules and you stay with the rules, sometimes you meet resistance wherein either an operator or like a nurse or even a physician might say that, oh my god, this is bureaucracy. This is too much paperwork. Why is all this necessary? Why are all these things necessary? And then that's when you may need to zoom out and remind that, hey, this is necessary because of these reasons. Uh, I often use the example with my patients that, say 100 years ago, traveling from New York to LA would take probably, 30 years kind of thing, people coming in carts and caravans and stuff like that. Now you can make that journey in 5 hours.
Mhm.
So that is the promise, right? 100 years ago, almost patients with cancer or rare diseases would die. Now there are cures, and we are having more and more long term survivors. But the cost for that is that when you board the flight, you follow the rules.
Mhm.
If you don't follow the rules at the airport, you would not be allowed to board the flight. The TSA rules, you have to follow them. Even in the flight, when they say put your seatbelt on, you have to put the seatbelt on. Like there is no hierarchy there. Like everybody has to follow that rule. And the reason those rules are there is for to keep you safe, but also to get you from say LA to New York in 5 hours, right?
Yeah. I think that's a great, that analogy is a great way to explain particularly the high level value of being able to telescope out when people are asking, like, why do I have to follow these rules? Why do I have to stay between the yellow lines? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
that makes sense.
yeah, so you just zoom out and say that like because you want to go from LA to New York in 5 hours, then you follow these rules. Or sometimes it's a cost thing also, right? Like so, like what we talked about before is you are really trying to prevent is expensive mistakes, right?
Mhm.
Somebody took the wrong turn or a wrong exit, then they delayed the journey, right? Kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's what you're trying to avoid, right? Giving them the handbook.
Wow. Well, it's been a very insightful conversation. So, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
No, thank you. This was great. Yeah.